CQB side parallax. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Maximum brightness.
Welcome everybody to the hotly anticipated Delta Stryker HD 1-10x24. This is a 34mm tubed first focal plane 1-10 LPVO that costs right around $1,700, weighs about 21 ounces, it's about 10.5 inches long, and has that sweet, sweet side parallax.
Pew pew pew.
As you've seen, also has very bright illumination,
Pew pew pew.
a fairly small border around the scope, and a fairly easily picked up illuminated reticle when it's illuminated. We'll talk on that more soon. But I'd first like to thank the people over at AnnexDefense.com, because without them, this video wouldn't be possible. They were nice enough to reach out to me and offer me this scope on loan so I could do a full review on it. So,
Pew pew.
to the people at AnnexDefense.com, thank you very much for making this video possible. And if you want to buy this or any other
Pew pew.
Delta product, go check out AnnexDefense.com. So with that, back to the review. 1-10 LPVOs are all the rage, especially when they are in the first focal plane format as seen here. Now, this is not the only first focal plane 1-10 LPVO, in fact far from it. You have this alongside with the EOTech Voodoo 1-10. Now, sadly, I haven't gotten my hands on the Voodoo, so I won't talk about that in this review.
Pew pew pew.
Despite me not getting my hands on the Voodoo, we can talk about some of the similarities, to which there are more than a few. They're, as near as makes a difference, the exact same price.
Pew pew pew.
The EOTech's about $100 more than this at about $1,800. They're the same weight at 21 ounces, the same length at 10.6 inches. The eye relief and the elevation turrets are also very similar. So, is that coincidence, or is that by design?
Pew 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 pew.
Scope manufacturers or scope companies using outside OEMs, whether it be in China, the Philippines, the US, or Japan to make their scopes is nothing new. I'm just saying that the Delta here and the EOTech Voodoo are probably a lot similar than they are farther apart. Is that a bad thing? No, not necessarily, but it just means that sometimes they'll be a little bit closer than they are farther apart. Anywho, opening up this simple cardboard box from this Delta shows that there isn't a whole lot as far as special features and paperwork on it. There's only a cattail, a battery, and that's about it. But all your money goes towards this optic. The Delta is being touted as being very lightweight at about 21 ounces, but on my scale it's closer to 23 ounces. To see if this is actually accurate, I pull out the PLxC, which is bang on perfect for what it is rated for from the factory. The feature that sets this LPVO apart from most other LPVOs in the 1-10 category is the fact that it has a side parallax, but more on that soon. Let's start at the back with the fast focus eyepiece and work our way forwards in typical fashion. Very solid, very tight. Really big throw. We got a little indicator on top just so you have some sort of way of indicating off of the housing. About a quarter turn in. A little bit of rock up and down, but really not noticeable other than that. Side to side is rock solid. Takes a lot of effort to turn, which I'm very pleased with. From there, we're going to check out the magnification ring, which as you can see, going from minimum to maximum is 180 degrees, which is pretty typical. And you do have 2 points for that little cattail to get screwed into for your personal preference. Increasing the magnification, there's no difference in tension. Decreasing magnification, it gets tight right around there. Continues to stay tight and then loosens up just before we get to 1x. It's not like, oh my god, I can't turn this, but there is definite resistance in this magnification ring. And it's consistent right around 3.5x to just before 1, right there to there. Let's move on to the illumination control. It's fantastic, it pops right into play, requires a good amount of effort to turn, so you don't have to worry about accidentally bumping this thing on and having it kill the battery. Not going to talk about the side parallax just yet, but it is a little bit larger than our illumination control, so if you're coming here in the dark, you can probably very easily, yeah, I got my eyes closed right now, you can definitely tell the difference between the two. One thing I'm not the biggest fan of is that the door going into the battery compartment for the illumination control is almost the same size as the control itself. Something like the PLxC, as seen here, performs the same task but significantly better. Because you won't have an accidental opening of the compartment, whereas opposed to the PLxC, you really have to want to get in there to open it. In my opinion, I'd rather have that. Inside the Delta compartment, you can see we have a very standard looking battery compartment. I haven't had any issues with these, so I wouldn't suspect you would either. One area where Delta really got things right was with the turrets. I'm going to go more in depth on this soon, but just know that the lockup on these things, the sound, the feel are incredible. For the size of the turrets themselves, they're very low profile, very, very slick and neat. They have 10 mils per rotation, which is something that I'm a huge fan of. They have the little line underneath the turret cap, so this way you can see exactly where you're adjusting it to. The sound and feel are incredible, and the ability to change your zero on them is as simple as removing the cap, adjusting it, and putting it back together. They are fantastic turrets and something that I would love to see on other scopes in the future. As you are clearly able to see and hear, these things perform and sound extremely, extremely well. The feel on them is sensational, and again, I'd love to see these on a low-profile LPVO of like the 2 to 12 category. I think they'd be incredible. The only thing that they are missing is a rev indicator and a zero stop. So if you're looking for both of those features, you'd have to look elsewhere. But other than that, they are superb. The S-Dog 1 first focal plane reticle, as seen here at 1x, doesn't look terrible when you're looking on a very white, non-noisy background. In fact, it's quite lovely. Unfortunately, it gets extremely hard to use and see in a more complicated environment, especially when you're not using the illumination. Happily, the illumination does get bright enough to be truly daytime bright, but if your battery craps out or the illumination flat out dies, you're going to be left with a reticle that's going to be very hard to use below 5x. At 5x is where you will start to see the entire ring, the larger ring, fill out the view. So something to just take note of as a rough idea of where we are magnification-wise. As you would have just seen, I adjust the rear eyepiece to get the reticle as sharp as possible. I found that this reticle just never seemed truly sharp to my eye from edge to edge. You can see clearly that the center is very sharp, but on the drops it seems to be a little bit hazy. This is something that I couldn't get any better than this, both on camera or to my naked eye. To a few people that I had get behind this thing in the time that I had with it, they felt about the same way. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is not the worst of it, and we'll be talking on that very soon. Also, take note of the reticle shift as I jockey the magnification ring back and forth. This is not the first time we've seen it on some first focal plane scopes, and multiple companies assure me it's okay, it's by design. They leave a little bit of tolerance in there, so this way things can move properly and not bind up. So I'm going to have to take them for their word on it. However, we will check to see if that is going to cause any problems on our tracking test very soon. The illumination here on a bright white wall is pretty nice. Shutting the lights off, you'll see that it does get a little bit hazy on the far edge, and to the naked eye, it almost gets too bright in these environments. You will have to step it down. To the keen-eyed viewer down in the basement, when the illumination was too high, you started getting this weird sort of reflection effect inside the scope. Almost every front focal plane LPVO will do that when the illumination is too bright. You just simply turn it down and it will mostly go away. However, that is something that you will have to take into consideration because most first focal plane LPVOs will do that when it's too bright. As well as do this. I noticed this by happenstance. I was filming, it was dark, I put the scope down, and I noticed a red glow coming from in front of the scope. The scope is currently set to 1x, and as we change the brightness setting, you can see that we still see it from the front, even in the lower brightness settings. But on its maximum, it gets really, really bright. So, just take note. If it's really dark out and you got the illumination on bright, and you're lining up with something or someone, they will probably see you, which is not what I want to have be an experience that I want to, notice. Increasing the magnification, you can see that it's still the same size, just the pupil on the back gets smaller. So, ladies and gentlemen, keep this in mind because this is something that you can't really avoid. Thanks to the fact that this thing has a side parallax, we can adjust the image to look beautiful here at 41 yards. This is typically a problem with most other scopes that have a fixed parallax because that's typically set at around 100 or 150 yards depending on the magnification setting. But here we have the adjustment going down from CQB to 100 to ELR, or extended long range. But tweaking it just so yields a fairly good looking image. Our mini box test of 4 down, 4 over shows that it is about 1/10 of a mil off on the elevation. Resetting the windage back to 0 shows that it was perfect, and increasing our elevation to a total of 10, you will see that we are, unfortunately, a couple of clicks off. We are about 2.5 clicks off. Now, that's still only about 2%, which is on the upper end of what I have seen from most high-end scopes, and typically it's in the realm of acceptable from the manufacturer themselves. Bringing the elevation back to 0, it lines up perfectly, so at least it tracks well enough inside of itself. It could be 2/10 of a mil off, but as long as it's always 2/10 of a mil off, you'll know that when you make an adjustment, it's going to go to exactly where you need it to be for your dope on your rifle and your ammunition at whatever distance. As far as checking for slop on both the windage and the elevation, there is none. So that is far more important than this thing being 2/10 of a mil off at 10 mils, especially like I said, when it's as consistent as this is, going up 10 mils and back to 0. So it might not be perfect, but it's still a good performance. It doesn't matter how good something tracks, or how good the illumination is, or how good the reticle is if it doesn't look good to actually get behind and use. The illumination here on a very visible, bright, sunny day is definitely daytime bright. It's not as bright as some other options in the first focal plane LPVO community, but it's still on the better side of things. I think I would prefer the center section of the reticle being the only thing illuminated, maybe being a little bit brighter than this. And then again, just having some posts at 3, 6, and 9 draw your eye more to the center. I don't know why manufacturers do this, but they do it. As far as transversing the power lines, they seem pretty flat, but there is a fair amount of fisheye that goes on, but it goes more than just being fisheye. Again, we're going to touch on that very soon. At least here, it looks fairly close to actually being 1x. You can see those power lines line up fairly similar on the inside to what we see on the outside, but as we transverse this power pole, you can see that it does some dancing towards the middle. If you're behind this thing and you're stationary, not moving, you won't really notice it, but when you are transitioning from target to target or you're scanning an area, you will notice it undoubtedly. Let's focus on the image quality here at 1x, which is very good. And the depth of field, you got 900 yards in the power towers and 10 yards or so on that tree in the foreground. And I gotta say, the image looks fantastic, all things considered. I briefly mentioned the side parallax earlier, but I did not showcase it because I wanted to have it come to life here. So let's go take a look at the knob real quick before we start playing with it. So the side parallax is what sets this thing apart, like I mentioned earlier. Not many LPVOs, if any other than this, really offer this feature, and it's something that a lot of people, myself included, have been waiting to see be brought out to market to see if it fixes some of the inherent issues with a first focal plane 1 to 10 LPVO. It is, in my opinion, that the 1 to 10 magnification range is just a little bit too extreme to package in a very small, lightweight housing such as this Delta Stryker HD and have it perform optically flawless from minimum to maximum. This is something that I saw with the Gen 3 Razor HD, at least in the example that I had. It had very poor performance going from its minimum to maximum. You could make it so this way it was great on one end or the other, but not both. I myself, as well as many others, was hoping that this would be the solution. As you can see on the top end, it has LR 100 in the middle and CQB at the bottom. Just note a cool fun fact is that when you put it to 100, there's a detent in the middle which locks it in place so it can operate as a normal LPVO like most others are set up from the factory. It has a very nice sweep and feels extremely good in hand. It is very well done. And adjusting it here at our 30-yard power transformer, you can see that we can fine-tune it to get a fairly good-looking image. We do have a bit of mirage because it was very cold when I filmed this. That's unfortunately one of the side effects of filming in the dead of winter. Inside my apartment was like 75 degrees and outside was in the 20s. So when you have a big temperature swing like that, you're guaranteed to have some mirage. Getting just so, however, we have a very good looking image, or at least as good as we can get in the middle. But on the outside, it does seem a little soft, and that coincides with how the reticle looks here as well. The center of the reticle looks fantastic. The outside on the drops does taper off a little bit. However, once we decrease the magnification to around 7 or 8, it does start to sharpen up quite nicely. Pulling the magnification back to around 4x, we're going to focus on a farther away target, our 400-yard brick building. And it's at 4x where I feel the reticle really is at its minimum for being useful for general purpose. What the hell do I mean by general purpose? I mean that you don't need to use the illumination to see the actual reticle, the drops, and actually use it effectively. At around 5x as we have it here, you can start to make out that tree at the bottom very, very nicely, which is a great touch. I love it, in fact. I wish more reticles had a finite tree like that you could use at greater distances at higher magnifications for more precise shots. However, I just don't think this reticle as a whole, this S-Dog1, has been executed extremely efficiently. In fact, I think most manufacturers mess up reticles on purpose, so this way you would look at other options to perhaps go with that route as opposed to this, because I do think, and there are other people that speculate this as well, some manufacturers work alongside some other manufacturers this way. No one can make the perfect scope. I know it's crazy talk, but there are conspiracies out there that some manufacturers do this as some sort of conglomerate. With the crazy talk out of the way, at 10x here at 400 yards, just on the side, parallax just so yields, again, a fairly good looking image. We do have a little bit of loss of contrast from the low-hanging light. This is earlier in the winter where, the light is fading and looks a little bit funny. And again, we do have the mirage from the difference in air temperature. I do feel that it is a useful looking image, but albeit not the best looking image. Pulling back the magnification to around 8 or so yields a much sharper and clearer looking image and reticle, which again, I don't think is by accident. I think it's just a super limitation of the 1 to 10 first focal plane scope or magnification range in general, because you might not buy a 1 to 10, you might buy like a 2 to 20 or like a 5 to 50. They're going to be handicapped somewhere. And speaking of handicaps, let's now focus our attention on our 900-yard power tower and see what sort of image stability we can get out of this thing. If you're fans of my channel, you know that if an image falls apart or a reticle falls apart when we're off of dead center, I absolutely hate the damn thing. Could you wonder and guess how this is going to perform? I don't think you're going to need to guess that much. In typical fashion, I set the illumination to its maximum to see how far off we can see it into the shadows, if at all, and we are going to start shifting the camera side to side to showcase you just how small of an exit pupil this thing has. I could not find any information on the exit pupil, but I guarantee you it is minuscule. Going slightly off center, you can see just how fast those shadows creep in, how fast the reticle and the image fall apart sharpness-wise. This is one of the most finicky, tight, and unusable eyeboxes I have gotten behind at almost any magnification. But it does not end there. Pulling back the magnification to roughly 6x, you can see we have a very wonderful image. But again, we have a very small exit pupil. Going ever so slightly off in either direction side to side yields a massive drop in sharpness on both the reticle and the image, and those shadows creep in extremely fast. Happily, however, we can see the illumination, but again, how useful is that really if you can't really see through the scope? I know some people will say you have to always shoot both eyes open and you could superimpose the dot on one side versus the other, and I agree with that wholeheartedly. At 4x, we notice a much larger increase of the eyebox, and we notice that the image does stay a little bit sharper for a little bit longer before we completely can't see through the thing anymore. The shadows creep in a lot later, and the image seems to stay a little bit sharper until we get a little bit farther out to the outside, so again, a better performance. And again, the illumination here is quite good. It doesn't shut off until we're well into the shadows, which is about as good as you could expect. Stepping it down one more time to 2x, it does something I had no explanation for. It got significantly worse. When you are slightly off center, look at how bad the image looks. It's so bad you can barely make out the center part of the reticle. I don't know why it does this. And again, it's one of, in my opinions, the biggest detriment of the 1 to 10 magnification range is that the glass is so stressed and they're trying to make the ends work, because without a good 1x or a good 10x, it's kind of crap. But in this case, the middle ground, that 2x to 3x really, really falls apart. At 1x, happily, however, it's fairly good. In fact, it's the best magnification range V performance that this scope can produce, but it's still nothing to write home about. This, in my humble opinion, is a massive failure, and using this scope in a dynamic role is very hard and challenging. Let me showcase this again on our tabletop. Starting at 10x, you can see we have no visible shadow, but the second we go off in either direction, you can see how small of a movement that is. You're talking about a 1/16 of an inch or so left or right starts to bring in those shadows. And there's nothing you can do about it. As far as bringing your eye closer or further away, it makes no difference. I got this to where it is as good as possible. Slowly bringing the magnification down in increments of 2x, you can see it's a little bit better, but not by much. I'm going to continue doing this until we get down to 1x. And again, what you see here is exactly how it's going to interpret it out in the real world. And this is in under peak conditions. Earlier, it was a bright sunny day with clear skies. This is a bright sunny, not a bright sunny room, but it's a very bright room on a white background. So everything's going to be as big and as usable as possible. And if it doesn't perform well here, in lower lights especially, it's going to perform significantly worse. Taking a more dynamic approach with this Eyebox to give you a better representation of how it's actually going to look like when you get behind it, here at 1x you can see it performs extremely well, all things considered. You not only have leeway side to side, but also forward to back. The illumination is completely visible up until you get into the shadows, and the image doesn't look all that distorted. It looks fairly flat. But unfortunately, things change when we increase the magnification to 2x here. Just like what we saw earlier, this image falls apart immediately once you go off center. And it's not just going side to side, it's also forward to back. The image just becomes unusable. And it's unfortunate because I find myself using LPVOs in the medium magnifications anyway, such as this. Increasing the magnification to 4x, the sort of result doesn't get much better. In fact, taking a look at this, it seems significantly tighter than where it was at 2x. And yeah, that should make sense because the higher in magnification you go, the smaller the exit pupil is going to be and thus the tighter the Eyebox. But it just seems to be worse than it really should be. Bumping it up to 6x, and this is where things start to get really tight. The image is a little bit more stable, meaning that the reticle and the view down range does remain sharper for longer, but it's still getting really, really tight. But nothing is as tight as the 10x on this thing. In fact, I have such a hard time trying to hold the camera steady enough to look through it that it's almost impossible. Side to side is super tight. Forward to back is about average for the 1 to 10s that I've seen, but still the performance isn't stellar. Because this scope goes up to 10x, it is eligible to come out here to 1,000 yards and showcase how good it can perform out at this distance. Like I had mentioned earlier, getting the center crosshair and the center of the image sharp isn't a problem, but look at everything outside that center. It just looks soft and blurry, and it can't get much better. I try adjusting the side parallax to get it sharper than this, but that's as good as it gets. It's really lacking here. So if you think you're going to take your 1 to 10 out to 1,000 yards with ease, it's going to be a little bit challenging. Adding our standard suite of roughly 10 mils of added elevation and reacquiring our target, you can see that the center on both the reticle and the image maintain about the same level of sharpness, if not a touch better. And as far as the rest of the image, I will give it the benefit of the doubt and say that it is a little bit on the sharper end. Getting into the low light environment, you can see here at 1x that it still allows in a lot of light. In fact, it looks exactly the same as what we see outside of looking through the scope, so that's a good performance. The illumination, again, as I said earlier, on a too bright of a brightness setting in a darker environment will start to sort of reflect back on the lenses, so that's something that you will note. But again, you set it down to a more appropriate brightness setting and you won't have such an issue. 1x is all fine and dandy, but increasing the magnification is where we're going to see if this thing's going to let in less light the higher up in the magnification range it goes. And despite the fact that this thing doesn't perform great otherwise, here it performs fairly well. However, just keep in mind that this thing will have a very small exit pupil on the best of conditions, so on the worst conditions like this, it's going to be so hard to maintain a good view looking through this that you might find it to be almost impossible. Because the biggest difference is this: a scope is going to have a fixed exit pupil at a given magnification. Your eye has a variable exit pupil. Well, not variable exit pupil, but a variable pupil. The darker the environment, the larger your pupil gets, and thus that exit pupil coming from the scope might be smaller than what your eye is set to given an ambient light such as evening like this, and thus you might get these weird shadowy artifacts that you can't figure out what it's caused from. That's why your iris is actually too big than the exit pupil coming from the scope. And with that quick anatomy lesson over, let's see how this thing performs under night vision. If it sounds like I'm talking inside of a fishbowl now, that is because I had to change locations, and for that I sincerely apologize, but this is what I'm dealing with currently with my move. It is painful, to say the least. You are looking through this Delta Stryker HD 1-10 through my Gen 3 PVS 14. This is obviously green phos. I do not have the spec sheet on it, but it is pretty good. I'm not going to say it's the best spec tube out there, but it gets the job done. Clearly here, the illumination on the lowest setting is more than usable under night vision. Granted, it's not complete pitch black out there, but it's a good representation of what the illumination is going to look like if you get behind this thing with night vision. Now, to use this passively, you would have to have the scope mounted extremely farther forward from where it would normally be to get a Gen 3 PVS 14 behind it. But nevertheless, if you want to see what this looks like in a roll like this, well, here it is. It works pretty damn well. Now, would it actually work in real life? Probably not. You'd have to put a clip on in front of the optic, but this is as good as I can do for right now. So I hope you enjoyed. With that, let's get into some side-by-side comparisons. The first comparison I'm going to make is with probably this thing's biggest competitor that isn't a direct clone of the Stryker, aka the Voodoo. It's going to be with the Gen 3 Razor HT 1-10x24. I apologize for having the font on top being so far off. I do this in different segments, and unfortunately I didn't check to see if it was going to be good, so I apologize. The first thing I have to take note of is how useless both of these reticles are at 1x. They're both so small and hard to pick up, with the exception of when you use them with illumination. With illumination, they work kind of well. As far as brightness, I have to give it to the Gen 3 Razor HD. It does have much brighter illumination, albeit a much smaller pinpoint center dot setup that they have going on. And it's not really a dot, it's kind of opaque. It's not a full solid reticle, and they did that by design, so this way when you're at the lower magnifications and you don't have the illumination on, you could see through it, so this way it doesn't obscure too much of a potential target downrange. So is it ideal? No, but they've made it work. Now, this optic I had reviewed was one of the ones that were made in Japan. It was a very early model. I do not know if this scope in particular had any optical issues, because like I said earlier, I couldn't get this thing to be perfect on either extreme. It was one or the other. I was left kind of nay impressed with the Gen 3 Razor HD. The Stryker, guess what? I was also nay impressed with. I really do think that the first focal plane 1-10 is just being pushed well beyond the limits of what's truly capable right now in a mainstream environment. I'm sure if a manufacturer went out there and did the best possible scope possible, it probably cost $4 or $5 grand, and it would probably be perfect. I'm looking at you, March, even though the 3-24 that I reviewed from you guys was the most disappointing scope I had ever reviewed, and I'm sure my review of that is the reason why you guys will never send me another scope in my entire life, but that's just the way it is. But with these two options, I think they're compromised, and they're compromised optically, and that's exactly what you don't want in an optic. As far as some numbers to compare against these two side by side, the first thing is going to be the price. The Stryker is like around $1,700-$1,800. The G3s are now around $2,500 for some reason. You can buy the assembled in the USA ones, but that's probably just for military purposes. I don't know if there's any major differences as far as the glass quality or clarity. But if you have experience with your G3 Razor and it's American made, please let me know in the comment section below, because it's not just me that look at the comments, it's other people too, to help paint a better picture of what's going to be a better optic for them. As far as the length and the weight, the Razor is going to come in at around 21.5 ounces, so not too far off from what the Stryker is. As far as the length, the G3 is actually shorter by about a ½ inch. As far as the field of view though, the Delta claims to have a much larger field of view at 25 feet at 1x as opposed to the Razor at 116 at 1x. But at the top end, guess what? Well, the Delta also claims that it's 12.8 feet as opposed to 11.7 with the G3. There is no exit pupil numbers for the Stryker that I could find, but the G3 actually has fairly large numbers at 10mm and 2.4mm respectively, and their eye reliefs are both about the same. The only thing I can say is the G3 has a much larger view looking through it. So even if the Stryker technically does have a larger field of view, the view through the G3 is much larger. It's Razor levels good. But still, I think both of these are quite optically challenged. Now, for all of you out there seriously considering a 1 to 10, I must ask you to look at a lighter, smaller 1 to 8. Namely, the primary arms PLxC. This is by far and away the smallest, most compact, best 1 to 8 first focal plane LPVO that I have personally reviewed. Now, do I think the Credo and AccuPowers are better? Yes, but they're significantly larger and heavier. But the PLxC manages to not only be small and lightweight, but still optically really good, as you can see here in the side-by-side. You have a very large view looking through it, an extremely small amount of body when you get behind the scope. You can see it right off there in the bottom left corner. It is so small, it just fades away. It is as close to Razor levels of performance without being an actual Razor. One big criticism a lot of people have with the PLxC is the illumination isn't that bright, but I argue that the reticle is so easy to pick up with the naked eye, even at 1x or any of the lower magnifications, that having super daytime bright illumination might not be necessary. However, if you do want brighter illumination, you're going to have to look elsewhere. Both the Stryker and the Gen 3 Razor are going to have significantly brighter illumination as opposed to the PLxC in the first focal plane form. However, Primary Arms is introducing the PLxC second focal plane with the Nova reticle, which is going to have probably the brightest illumination of any reticle on any scope on the planet. But that's going to be second focal plane, really doesn't fit in this sort of category. The Primary Arms comes in at about 17 ounces. That is about 5 ounces lighter than the Stryker. It also comes in significantly shorter, about 1.25 inches shorter than the Stryker. However, it's not going to lighten your wallet by a whole lot because it is a substantial price savings over the Stryker, because you can find a PLxC for like around $1,200–1,300, which is around $400 to $500 less expensive than the Stryker. I don't need to tell you guys about the optical performance because you could see it for yourself in front of you. The PLxC at 8x gives a more than usable image. Granted, the outside edge might be a little bit soft, but the inside is very sharp and clear. And the Eyebox I find to be quite forgiving. Now, as far as the exit pupil goes, for the Stryker, we don't find any information, but to compare it against something like the Gen 3 Razor, let's say, it's going to be a little bit smaller of an exit pupil, which means that the Eyebox is going to be a little bit smaller and a little bit tighter, which is something that unfortunately just comes the nature of having a compact scope. Smaller and lighter doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be better in every other regard. It's going to have sacrifices somewhere, and it comes in the form of a smaller, tighter exit pupil, which means a smaller, narrower Eyebox, which if you're like me and you like to shoot in a dynamic roll, it's not going to be ideal. However, in comparison with the Stryker, it's going to be, as near as makes no difference, the same. Where these two scopes greatly differ is with the overall setup on their controls. The Stryker is set up much more like a DMR style scope, such as with the Credo or the AccuPower, where the PLxC does give you the option for an exposed elevation turret, but it's non-locking. Are these two direct competitors? They're close, but they definitely are set up for their specific roles. Shifting gears just a little bit in the opposite direction, we're now looking at the Swampfox Arrowhead second focal plane 1 to 10. Why did I bring in a second focal plane 1 to 10 with similar style turrets to the Stryker? Well, what happens if you're working on a much tighter budget and you're not really sure if you want to go second focal plane or first focal plane? What are the key differences? Well, In the second focal plane form, you're going to have a much more usable reticle, in my opinion, in the lower magnification ranges because you can see the reticle and you can easily put it on a target and take a shot and probably make a hit because you don't have to guess or wonder where the reticle is. You can very clearly see it. The illumination is lacking on the Arrowhead, but guess what? It's a $500 scope as opposed to a $1,700 scope. Granted, they are made in China and they don't sort of fill you full of super confidence with how they feel or the materials used, but optically, it is a superior optic to the Stryker. But it's simply because it's second focal plane. If the Stryker was second focal plane, it too would have probably really good glass, especially combined with those great turrets and all the controls. It would actually probably be a really nice little setup. But unfortunately, this is what companies think everybody wants. But it's because that's what everyone buys. So, damn, it really is sort of a catch-22. Anyway, with the Arrowhead, yeah, it's $500. Yeah, it's made in China. It's going to be about 3 ounces lighter. It's going to be about the exact same length. It's going to have about the exact same field of view. And again, because we don't know the exit pupil on the Stryker, it's going to have similar exit pupils of that found to the PLxC. Again, primarily just because it's a 1:10, not a 1:8. It's going to have the exact same eye relief, about 3.5 inches, and it's a fairly capable optic. Optically speaking, the Arrowhead is wonderful. All the controls on it are pretty good. Yeah, there are some issues like the splines on the elevation and windage turrets are half that of the actual adjustment figures. So if you want to set your zero perfectly, you can't. You might be in between your perfect zero. But this is just rolled in here. So this way, if you guys are not sure about the whole 1:10 thing, are there other options out there? Yes, there are. And yes, they can be in the 1:10 family, but they're going to be in the second focal plane variety like this Arrowhead. I was going to bring in an Athlon that I had reviewed a while ago that was a 1:10 that was also optically surprisingly really good, but again, it was second focal plane and it sort of fell in between what the Arrowhead is versus the Stryker, so that is why I rolled in the Arrowhead. My last major comparison is going to be with the Athlon Helos BTR Gen 2 2-12, and the reason for this is you might be looking at the Stryker as a possible DMR optic. And sure, it has so many great features that could allow you to use this thing essentially from 0 yards to 1,000 yards with great turrets and potentially great reticles. Yeah, the Stryker reticle is great above 8x, but below that, it's okay. But what happens if you're looking for something that is going to perform, in my opinion, optically better, dynamically better, be significantly less expensive, and if you are planning on running an offset red dot anyway, why even bother going with a 1:10 as opposed to even a 2:10 with, aka the Mark V HD, or this for significantly less money? Now, there are people that are going to be like, well, I don't want a Chinese-made optic. Okay, Mark V HD, significantly more expensive, and you start rolling into all of that sort of issues. There are other scopes out there in like the 2.5 to 15 category. I'm talking about Steiner T6XI, but you only come with the SCR reticle, and I think it's going to be too small, below like 4x, but we'll hopefully find that out together one day soon. I'm rolling this out as a possible alternative. Yes, these things go for around the $500-ish price point. They are made in China. They're going to be a little bit heavier, but only by about 2 to 3 ounces. They're also going to be about an inch longer, but you're going to have a much larger front objective, which should help with ambient light. You also have a larger view looking through it, which is not that hard to believe. You also have less scope body that you do see. In my opinion, the best reticle for dynamic shooting on the planet, but people still want to argue that the 1 MOA center dot is just way too big and not fine enough. You're a bench shooter. You're a bench shooter. You're not shooting from dynamic rolls. And guess what? It's the truth. Just accept it. There's nothing wrong with that. But we don't shoot the same way, and that's fine. That is absolutely fine. It's going to be a little bit heavier, it's going to be a little bit larger, but not by a significant margin. And again, if you're going to be planning on running an offset red dot anyway, why bother with a 1x LPVO when you can get into a really decent MPVO and still have that offset red dot goodness? And guess what? You're getting 2 extra X on top, which are, as you can clearly see here, very usable when you're looking at the exact same 200-yard target on very similar conditioned days. Now, as far as eye relief, guess what? They're about the same. And as far as our field of view, well, that's going to be completely different because they're two totally different magnification ranges, albeit 1x different on the bottom and 2x different on top. We now have 55.7 feet at 2x and 9.6 feet at 12x. But I assure you, it's really not going to be that different whatsoever from the Stryker pound for pound. So same magnification versus same magnification. Again, I roll this in because it's just another alternative, another option, another way of thinking. Maybe you're unsure. Maybe you are just here to listen to me talk, in which case I can talk for hours on end. But I think even I would get tired of hearing myself talk after a while. In fact, truth be told, I really hate listening to myself, so I do this for your pleasure, not mine. If you want something that's going to be like the BTR Gen 2, but more higher end, I'll say, as far as qualitative feel and where it's made, look no further than the Mark V HD 2-10. It's not 100% perfect, but it's as near as makes no difference that as long as you're fine spending the money that those things call for, you're in for a real treat. Technically, these two are side by side, and it is in the comparison format, but what you're looking at on the right-hand side is the Stryker HD 1:6, which in my opinion, and in my findings and my experience with it, is a benchmark, lightweight, simple second focal plane 1:6 LPVO. It falls right in line with the Credo HX 1:6 as well as the Tango 6T second focal plane 1:6. They're all in that same sort of category as far as similar size, weight, controls, and just optical clarity and performance. Pick your poison as far as which one you want between those three, but they're all really impressive. Just because a company makes one thing that's really, really, really good doesn't mean that they're going to make everything really, really, really good, especially when they're just ordering stuff from Japanese OEMs. Yes, these are made all in Japan. All the Stryker HDs are made in Japan, which is great. I love to see that. But it doesn't mean that you're going to get the same quality and performance optically across the entire board. The 1:6 is, again, it's almost a benchmark. Everyone that I've recommended it to that had bought one loves the thing, and rightfully so. It's got excellent glass clarity, excellent illumination brightness. The reticle might be a little mundane and simple, but for a simple point and shoot 5,200 yard zeroed LPVO on a go-to gun, it more than performs. Just look at the view looking through it, and look at how small the scope body is. It's wonderful. They're also fairly small and lightweight, and it really is just a very nice, usable package. Whereas this 1:10, in my opinion, is just a little bit of a hodgepodge. They really tried to develop something that could potentially be incredible. But again, they did it in a package that was just reaching a little bit too far. If this Delta Stryker was a 1:8 as opposed to a 1:10, I guarantee it would be a much better optically performing scope, and it would really correlate with what they were trying to go for with this thing. But because they focused on it being a 1:10 and going for the number game and going for what sells and what people think that is the best thing on the market, it's the whole reason why it falls short. And that to me is really, really upsetting. There really is nothing left for me to say that I haven't already said within an inch of its life. Delta tried to improve upon the 1:10 first focal plane LPVO by including a side focus and really focusing on excellent turrets and otherwise good controls, and they did seem to improve upon it. However, optically this thing still has a major flaw, and that has been hopefully translated in this video to you without question or without doubt. There are so many things to love about this optic, but for me, this is for me, this isn't necessarily for you, but for me, the optical issues that it has are, without a shadow of question of doubt, something that I cannot live with. I'm hoping that they'll see the light, pull this exact optic out in a 1:8 that will fix some of the optical issues, and then it would be 100% warranted and justifiable to purchase for many, many people if the optics are fixed. It's the only thing that's wrong with this thing is the optics, and that's probably the most important thing. Anywho, this video is already way too long, so with that, I'm going to conclude this thing really quickly. Delta, if you're listening, which I really hope you are, you're so close to building something truly spectacular, but this thing just does not hit the marks for me. Again, a huge thank you to annexdefense.com for making this video possible. They lent this thing to me for about 2 months so I can get all of my filming done with it and all of my testing done with it, and they were absolutely wonderful to deal with. So again, thank you very much, Annex, and thank you all very much for watching my videos. And if you've made it this far in the video, almost 44 minutes, you're a real trooper. Thank you very much for watching. And as always, see you again next time. And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below, and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.